Welcome to the Guest House. I'm Sean Perel. I'm an integrative therapist, a yoga and meditation teacher, a lifelong student of the thesis of our belonging, and I'm also a parent and a fellow human being grappling with many of the same questions that you may be grappling with too. In these conversations, I'm turning to some of the folks I most admire, and together we're exploring the complexities and also the creative potential of being human in an era of radical change. Thank you so much for being with us.
My guest today is Kasey Hendricks Crown. Kasey is a transpersonal psychotherapist. She's a clinical supervisor. She's a consultant. She's a wellness educator. And she's also an activist who challenges traditional mental health paradigms and advocates for a balanced integration of scientific and spiritual perspectives, which I so resonate with. Kasey has over a decade of experience in facilitating healing for individuals and groups, and she focuses on unlocking vital wisdom to help people reconnect with their true selves. Along with Jackie Lenardini, Kasey is also the visionary co-founder of WellSoul, a dynamic wellness education company designed to guide individuals toward profound healing and self-discovery. I am so happy to have you in conversation today, Kasey. I've been looking forward to this one.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
I like the starting point of just your human journey into this work. Is there anything that you feel comfortable sharing about your personal journey into the healing arts to kind of kick off our conversation here?
Sure. Yeah. I think like a lot of people in my profession and in the healing arts in general, I came to the work kind of through my own healing journey. You know, I had experienced some developmental trauma that was largely kind of disintegrated. I was experiencing a lot of kind of somatic, responses to that early developmental trauma in my teens and even early into my early 20s. I had a tremendous amount of anxiety and I was pretty fragmented. I engaged in a lot of high-risk behavior. I was abusing substances. There were lots of coping strategies that I had enacted to kind of cope with and deal with just what I hadn't faced. You know, without going into too much detail about kind of events themselves, to me, the more interesting part and the more important part is the healing piece, right? It's like I found myself kind of crashing and burning into treatment in my early 20s, which was a tremendous blessing. And it really kind of initiated this healing journey that I've now been on for over half of my life. So I was introduced to energy medicine really kind of early on in the process. And that has been pretty foundational to my journey and to my work, to my personal healing journey and to my work. In those early years, I did a lot of traditional Western psychotherapy and treatment, and simultaneously was kind of traveling and studying with the different spiritual teachers that I had gravitated towards. And so my work has really been about how do we bring it all together in a really cohesive way that's very grounded in not only science and clinical psychology, which I think are really important parts of the healing process, right? I think we really need an understanding of how the brain and the body respond to our environment and our experience, and also zoom out and look at this from a wider lens, from a, soul perspective.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So I guess the question in there is like, what is going on? Like, what is it about the sort of science and magic of being in a therapeutic relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it is a constant practice for me of getting to reinforce humanizing and relating to other people's experiences, right? And there's all sorts of, science that we could draw upon. Obviously, you brought up interpersonal neurobiology. I think interpersonal neurobiology is more of a framework, right? It's like not a theoretical orientation that I'm working from. It's more of a framework for drawing on different disciplines of science, psychology, and looking for kind of through lines in how we understand the human experience, right? And interpersonal neurobiology is very much about like creating a cohesive framework for understanding mind, brain relationship and the integration process, right? So, and I think the reason that I love this framework and I teach it is because for me, it's a framework that really bridges the scientific with the spiritual, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it intends to or not is a different story. It just does because of its emphasis, I should say, on consciousness as energy flow, right? So for example, when you think about trauma, I'm going to depersonalize trauma for a second and look at it from an energetic perspective, but like trauma is essentially energy, right? That is coming into a system. And that system is getting disorganized as a result of that energy, right? It can't organize the energy and the information. So we go into chaos when that happens, as systems do. And when we think about this from an energetic perspective, there's energy that comes into the system abruptly without our kind of invitation, right? Energy is, both relational, right? It's exchanged between us and our environment, and it's embodied. So it's emergent, right? We're conduits for it. So it's like if I'm experiencing this kind of abrupt energy coming in from the outside to disrupt the system and become disorganized, it then becomes about how do I work with energy, right? To re-regulate and ground the nervous system, right? To heal, to what energy do I need to kind of bring in, right? Attune to, connect with in order to heal that state of chaos and disorganization that occurs from a traumatic injury.
I just kind of love the bridge, because I do think we often, especially like we can have the perspective of from Western frameworks of healing, looking over at more spiritual frameworks and being like, how do we actually bridge these?
That's right. And it's confusing for a lot of people. And I think part of the reason it's confusing is because of the word spiritual, and we can talk about linguistics later, but spiritual, right? Spirituality for people is kind of a loaded term. And so I think like people get kind of a little nervous around that word. They don't always know what people mean by it. Does it mean like religion? Does it mean God? Like, what do you mean when you use the word spiritual? And so I always like to define what I mean when I use the word spiritual, which is essentially that I see myself as a soul. I see myself as having an energy body, right? A consciousness that is, distinct from the physical material part of who I am, right? And so, and I see that energy, right, if you will, or that soul as transcendent, that it exists above and beyond the physical human experience. And so that allows me to hold a wider perspective. I think that you can have this kind of energetic perspective and be an atheist, right? Mm-hmm. You can have this energetic perspective and, be super religious. So spirituality is more about what frequency, right, do I want to align with, attune with, right, as an evolutionary soul. And so when I experience trauma, let's go back to the interpersonal neurobiology framework, and my system gets disorganized and goes into chaos, and I adopt all sorts of maladaptive coping strategies to deal with that chaos in my system, which might be, a lot of them are kind of emerge from fear, right? From the frequency of fear, the energy of fear. If that's the energy that I'm then running in my system, right, I need to bring in a different frequency, a more expansive frequency of energy in order to diffuse that fear. When I think about this in terms of energy, it's like spirituality to me is about attuning to and connecting with the most expansive states of consciousness that exist in the unified field. I'm going to attune to frequencies of love, compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, creativity, right, as part of my healing process. And then it becomes about constantly discerning, right, what frequency am I in alignment with or in attunement with when I say this, when I do this. So interpersonal neurobiology really helps just kind of bridge the framework between our scientific understanding of how energy works, how it materializes into physical form. We are bodies, biological beings. We have nervous systems and brains that are shaped by energy and information flow. This is really important. We have to understand how energy materializes in physical form, how it leads to mental illness, right? How it leads to addiction, how it leads to depression. But all of it is energy. So if we can kind of go, okay, let me get my footing around understanding energy, understanding systems, right? Understanding what is the relationship between the mind, the brain, and my environment, right? These things all kind of, from a scientific perspective, we have a lot of information about that. And then from a spiritual perspective, what we know is that spiritual practice, meditation, mindfulness practice, running energy as we do at WellSoul, energy medicine of all sorts, these practices are really about attuning to these more expansive frequencies that are going to help us come into that state of coherence that you talked about at the beginning, right? Like we have to come into coherence, we have to come into balance. And so to me, these scientific and spiritual perspectives really kind of effortlessly coexist. And, you can use whatever language you want to describe the energy. I do use the word divine. I do use the word God in my own practice because I think it has a holy fire to it that is different than if you use the word universe. But you can do all of this work without that language or even perspective on energy, right? That energy, you don't have to see energy in that way.
When we're reducing our spiritual experience into scientific terms, some integrative whole can permeate but not be named. And you use the word divine, that's kind of like spark of whatever is the kind of source of healing or the potency of healing that we're inviting into any process.
That's right. Yeah. You have to invite it in. My business partner always says, shadow energy is not polite. It will enter without regard, right? Shadow energy is not polite, but divine energy is, and it wants to be invited in and it wants to co-create with you. So you can invite it in and cultivate a relationship with it. And I feel like a lot of what we're teaching at WellSoul, which is, the workshops that my partner and I teach, is about cultivating practices where we really develop a relationship with these expansive kind of frequencies of energy, right? It's not enough just to set an intention or to, like you said, a lot of this can lead to bypass because language is only as powerful as the energy that's behind it. If I'm just setting an intention every once in a while, but that intention is disembodied, I don't believe I deserve it, I don't believe I can have it, right? Then I'm just spinning my wheels. But if I'm setting an intention and I'm noticing, what I'm experiencing as I write this intention is doubt about whether or not I deserve this, or whether or not this is, or maybe fear about what would happen if I did create this, too much responsibility, you name it, right? Whatever the intention is, all sorts of feelings, which also have frequencies, emerge. And if some of them are shadow frequencies, right? Fear, doubt, insecurity, shame, we have to actually cultivate a practice to break agreements with those frequencies, break agreements with those energies, and invite in the energy that we need to be able to create, right? And when we experience trauma, right, because it materializes in the physical and creates these patterns, we end up reinforcing these fear narratives, these shame narratives, over and over and over again throughout our lives. And so in order to create something anew, to evolve out of the trauma and to move into our creativity, which is what healing is all about, right? We have to create a discipline around acknowledging and noticing what the frequency behind the feeling is that we're in relationship to, breaking agreements with it, essentially saying, no, I'm not in agreement with doubt. I'm not in agreement with fear, right? And then attuning to and bringing in the energies that are more expansive to help us continue to push that shadow frequency out of our space, right? And all of this energetic work, right, is what's happening in mindfulness practice, right? What the way that we teach it is very specifically about attuning to and connecting to and understanding the frequencies of energy that we're in relationship to all the time. Because when you start to see things energetically, it's like a whole other world opens up, and you start to recognize how often you might be in agreement with a certain frequency of energy that's in your way, right? That's diminishing you, right? And typically those they emerge from a creative kind of coping strategy. They emerge to protect us. So we have to kind of do the work of disagreeing with those old narratives, right? But not only that, breaking up with the energies that we've actually kind of enslaved ourselves to as a result of those narratives.
Powerful.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of trailed off into energy medicine work versus interpersonal neurobiology, but you can see like they kind of segue into one another pretty effortlessly.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm hearing is that this isn't just a narrative process. It is a deeply felt, intuitive, integrative process.
That's right.
And, the word mindfulness, I think it's just, we need better vocabulary.
I know. We really do.
Because it has such an embodied quality. What you're describing has such a deeply embodied quality of being able to see where we're contractually bound and what authentic pathways of freedom, of realignment, of healing.
Absolutely. At WellSoul, we have 5 pillars, and pretty much everything we teach and we do within the context of the workshop follows or falls into one of these categories. And the 5 pillars are embodied presence being, the first one. Of course, they're nonlinear, but like the way that we present them is always with embodied presence first, because there is a very different quality of presence when we're actually in our bodies. And trauma really has a way of ejecting us from the body, right? Of separating us from this vessel, this instrument that we all have, that is really the vessel for energy and information, right? It's like we experience insight and information in many ways through the body. And so if we're not connected to it or attuned to it, because it's not safe to be inside of it, then we've just kind of cut ourselves off from so much potential. So integration is the key, and practice is the key to integration. I think that there's a lot of, in more traditional kind of maybe perhaps antiquated therapeutic models, like there's a lot of coming to talk about the experience that you've had or that you're having. And there's, in a way, like, just not to say that talk therapy isn't helpful, because it is, but it has to be accompanied with a practice outside of that experience that helps you to integrate whatever insights are emerging from the therapeutic process, if you will. Oftentimes, this is actually why I work less frequently on a weekly basis with clients, and I've moved more into a consulting capacity, is because I would rather you come to a workshop and I work with you monthly or quarterly, and we find we help resource you with other kinds of practices and that you're engaged in throughout the week that are a part of a really comprehensive journey to healing, that are more of a lifestyle change than they are even perhaps a healing journey, because we're constantly evolving. And so we need practices to help us integrate new information and energy as it comes in. I mean, right now, the world is in such chaos, and that's a lot of energy and information floating around. And our bodies are having to take all of that in on a daily basis. And if I don't know how you feel, but I know that if I didn't have a practice and tools to like work through and, you know, take care of my own energy as all of this is happening around us and things are rapidly changing, I don't know that I'd be in a state of well-being, right? I'd either have to completely dissociate or, you know, I'd be in probably a high level, have high levels of anxiety as I once did, right? Because it's just a lot for the system to handle.
Right. So, and seeing that at mass scale.
Exactly.
So when you speak about practices, I imagine that you're not just talking about meditation and massages. I imagine that what you're talking about is a nuanced toolkit that includes a lot of sort of mindful interventions, such as establishing authentic boundaries and identifying authentic boundaries and developing more energetic awareness of where is their resonance and where is their dissonance and how am I cultivating alignment with, you know, higher resonance in my life. So can you share a little bit more about just like, how do you support people really, you know, identifying their practices or toolkit?
Okay, that's a great question. It's funny. I hosted a workshop or facilitated a workshop last weekend, and my husband happened to come to it. And, you know, somebody said to him, oh, you know, do you do her morning practice with her? And my husband and I just burst out laughing. We were like, my morning practice? Like, I wake up and I'm like kind of grumpy until I've had my coffee, like, and my kids are at school. There's no morning practice happening in the way that I think we've been conditioned to believe that people who are doing this work and teaching this work are engaged with, right? Like everybody has to go through a process of discovery around what practices work for them. It's less about, you know, having the meditation mat and the candles and the like, you know, creating the space and the time for meditation than it is about actually like engaging in practices that work throughout the day. So for me, my practice doesn't look like I think a traditional practice would look like, and I don't teach a traditional practice or in my workshops. So, you know, the practice of running energy is one example. Essentially, you know, it's about grounding yourself, right, in present time. And so at any point throughout the day, when you're getting in the car to put your, you know, take your kids to school, when you are dropping them off, when you are, you know, sitting down to work, you can ground yourself and connect yourself to a higher vibrational frequency of energy, which is a practice that I'm kind of accustomed to doing many, many, many times throughout the day. My clients will tell you that at the beginning of every session, we do a grounding where we, you know, drop grounding cords, connect to the supreme being or the supreme energy, and then we clear the space, right? Let's push out anything that's not in alignment. Let's clear the space of any shadow frequencies, anything I'm in agreement with that is creating suffering or limitation, right? So I start to visualize moving that energy out in a variety of different ways. I have different tools for that. And then it becomes about bringing in the energies that I want: clarity, trust, truth, certainty, knowing, seniority over my own knowing, sovereignty, creativity, compassion, curiosity, forgiveness, love. I'm bringing those energies in every day. I say them 100 times throughout the day, maybe not 100, let's say 30 times throughout the day, because I'm with clients or I'm doing it in my car. I'm also about intention. So it's like, I'm going to consistently name, again, internally or externally, depending on the circumstances, what my intention is, right? So if I'm entering into a conversation with a client, my intention is to be a channel for grace and wisdom and to get out of my own way and to be neutral and to hold a space of compassion and forgiveness. And I will name that intention in the context of the session. And just by virtue of the fact that I'm naming it, it's like we are syncing up, me and that person sitting across from me, around a shared intention for the session. And it is a very corrective process, right? So you can think of intention as prayer, just daily prayer. You can think of intention as sitting down and trying to manifest or, right, materialize some vision for your career, for your family. There's so many ways to enact intention in our lives, right? When I'm going on a trip with my family, I set a very clear intention that's less about what is the outcome of the experience than it is about how am I going to relate to myself and to my family as I go through the experience, right? So in doing that, I'm getting more connected to the embodied experience of what it is like to be in relationship to, you know, this group of people from a place of compassion, from a place of love, from a place of neutrality, right? Where I'm not in judgment, where I'm not in agreement with perhaps energy that maybe if I wasn't so attuned to an intention could easily sneak in and kind of hijack our experience.
I love that. I mean, with intention too, it's a remembrance. It's also like when we've noticed that we're kind of far from our intention. And I love where you were talking about running energy is just how interstitial a practice like that can be in the day. That really, and I appreciate this so much for how busy we all are. You know, so many of us in our household or phases of life, it's like, you know, yeah, oh, that old practice that I used to have, you know, that time in my life when it, you know, no, it's actually something where you're describing could happen, I imagine, within the cycle of one breath.
Or just even if you're, you know, if what's arising in you is feeling, if there's some dis-ease that's arising, there's always information underneath that dis-ease. So we have to break agreements with the dis-ease before we can get the information, if that makes sense, right? Sometimes the dis-ease itself creates a filter, a fog that is unhelpful, right? It's only helpful insofar as our body has been alerted to an experience that needs to be addressed, right? So when we experience pain in the body in some way, it's always information. So it's kind of a way of like almost like pulling the pain out of the body and looking at it. First, I'm going to disagree with the frequency of energy that I'm in agreement with that's making it difficult for me to see that, right? So I'm breaking agreement to fear. And then I'm going to go, okay, what's the wisdom that's presenting itself here in this moment? So, and like, you can do that again throughout the day because we get triggered in all sorts of ways by whatever information and energy are coming into our system. And so it's more of a energetic hygiene thing is kind of the way we talk about it. It's like you brush your teeth, you wash your face, you run your energy, right? It's about hygiene. And the more you do it, right, the more you clear your channel, the more you correct your energy into alignment with more expansive frequencies, right? The more you are able to access information and energy and it flow in an authentic way. That's when you're attuning to things like intuition in a very clear way, right? You have to clear the channel, right? And if the channel is all kind of, I think of that game of Operation, you know, where it's like you touch a different part of the body and it's like kind of a little alarm system goes off. And it's like, if the channel's got like, you know, is buzzing with different little alarm systems, then we have to do the work of clearing it so that we can get clear information.
It's interesting because the way that you're describing this, which, you know, is not always how we think about intuition, is that a precursor for real intuitive flow and attunement is actually a certain kind of discipline. It's not by accident, right?
Well, there's different kinds of intuition. So like for at least the way that I understand intuition from my own personal practice, and also Carolyn probably influenced this perspective quite a bit. But, you know, I think I recall she talks about intuition as having kind of three levels. There's like third chakra intuition, which is like gut survival intuition, right? It's like, you know, we all have this. We are born with this level of intuition. It's almost like, to me, I think of it as the limbic intuition, because it's like, it's like the body's alarming you to danger or to, right? So there's the gut instinct. Then there's fifth chakra intuition, which, the fifth chakra is really about creative, essentially like creation of our own will, right? It's about expression of our own will. So when I think of fifth chakra intuition, I think of more creative intuition. So intuition that is coming through, that is related to my personal experience, right? My personal journey, right? And then seventh chakra intuition is inspirational intuition. So this is kind of like non-personal or depersonalized intuition, right? Like information and energy that drops in from the unified field that is not necessarily emergent in the way that fifth chakra intuition is emergent. But all of these intuitive capacities have to be developed, right? They're not, aside from third chakra intuition, which is pretty kind of basic and primal, fifth and seventh chakra intuition, they have to be cultivated through practice. So the more trauma you have, and this is really what my work is about, the more trauma you have, the less access we have to your wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. And we want full access to your wisdom, right? Not only because that wisdom is going to keep you safe, but that wisdom is going to help you create, right? And we're all creative beings. We're all creators. We're here to create, right? I'm not talking about paintings or fine art. I'm talking about finding your gift, your unique gift, and sharing it with the world, right? The greatest act of service, right? So but we are often crippled by just trauma, which creates all this fragmentation and debris, like psychological, spiritual debris in the system. And until we can clear that, we don't really have access to our intuition in the way that we would ideally like. And I also think like there's the simultaneous work of clearing the channel. And then there's the work of learning how to cultivate agency over your own energy body. And this to me is the most important work that can be done in the world right now. I think that there is a lack of agency that people have over their own energy, right? And so we are so susceptible to things entering the system, right, that are creating harm and creating confusion, illusion, and delusion in all of us, and that are leading to all of this kind of reactivism is what I would call it. It's not activism, it's reactivism, right? Because we're all operating on this impulse, but it's rooted in confusion, illusion, and delusion energy. So if you don't have agency over your energy field, just about anything can influence how you think and feel.
This is an interesting thing that I think we often get wrong about the idea of resonance and dissonance, because we think resonance is like positive and dissonance is negative, but sometimes dissonance can be a really healthy expression of an energetic boundary, right?
Absolutely.
And resonance sometimes can be the way that a contagion of reactivity can move through a crowd.
That's right. And actually you could argue the same thing for empathy, right? So resonance, I would argue, is what you're describing has, we live in a culture where empathy is celebrated. We're all saying we all need more empathy, right? And we're trying to cultivate all this empathy in these children. And yes, I am a therapist. Empathy is super important. I'm not diminishing the value of empathy. But the way I think of empathy is similar to how Kristen Neff, I think, talks about it, which is that empathy is dangerous if there's no boundary for it. Right. So compassion is really the boundary for empathy, because compassion says, it's really coming more from trust and love. It says, I give you the dignity of your own process, right? Empathy has a way of, if it's unchecked, we can martyr ourselves to the experience of empathy. So what I mean by that is empathy is this capacity to put ourselves in other people's shoes and and essentially try on their suffering so we can get a sense of what that is. And the idea is with empathy, we'll have more regard for other people. We'll understand them more. But no matter what, even when we're empathizing, we are never fully able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And we never fully understand and know the whole story from a karmic perspective, from a, even from a micro and a macro perspective. And we are entering into that empathy from our own lens, from our own context, right? We have our own fog in there that we forget exists. So even as we think we're really understanding something from someone else's shoes, we are perceiving it to some degree through our own foggy lens. And so one of the things that's happening with empathy is people are kind of like, they're going into empathy with their own foggy lens, putting themselves in other people's shoes, and then taking on the experience of other people's suffering and assuming they know more than they know about that person's experience. And then making choices to act on their behalf, oftentimes without their direct or explicit request, in ways that are really self-motivated. So to me, empathy is, or too much resonance, as you kind of referred to it, is something that really needs to be refined, clarified, grounded. We always say at our workshops, you want to feel it to reveal it to heal it. Essentially to say, get in and get out. The emotional experience is valuable insofar as it reveals energy and information. So when you experience a feeling, you want to understand the information beneath it. We were talking about this earlier. But if you just stay in the feeling and martyr yourself to that feeling because you're quote unquote empathic, that's not helpful. It's not helpful to the person that you're empathizing with, and it's certainly not helpful to you. You have just lost agency over your own energy, right? You have created even more fog in your lens.
Through the kind of emotional looping.
That exactly.
Perpetuating.
And merging, looping.
Okay.
You could see it in a couple of different ways. But so our whole thing is every time we run energy, the first thing we do is we call our energy back. Besides grounding ourselves, we call our energy back. Call it back from the past, call it back from the future, call it back from anyone who has your energy, anywhere it was given away, stolen, that you let it go, right? You're calling it back from people. And oftentimes when you get somebody in front of you and you ground and you connect to, the supreme being, and then you start calling your energy back, you can see very clearly, oh gosh, I can see now where my energy has been, how fragmented it is. And so I think a lot of what happens, people get lost. Their energy gets lost in places it doesn't belong. Empathy is super helpful, but you want to get the information and the wisdom, right? What am I to know and how am I to grow from this experience? What then shall I do with this information? And sometimes there's an action step that accompanies it, and that's maybe a form of service. Sometimes there's more questions that accompany it. But the whole idea is like, we want to be cultivating agency over our energy. We want to call our energy back into present time. We want to clear our energy out of all of its debris. And we want to really make space for our own wisdom to both emerge and to drop in.
I've heard you describe boundaries as actualizing or actionizing self-esteem. How do you see boundaries in this process of essentially gaining agency?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think boundaries help us kind of sustain agency over our own energy body, and they're valuable for so many reasons. I caution people with boundaries. I think we've kind of been taught to believe that boundaries are this rigid kind of no, right? And boundaries are really, we want them in all of our relationships. Even the healthiest relationships need boundaries, right? If I'm in a relationship with somebody that is causing me harm, a more kind of distant boundary is going to be necessary, right? But if that person, let's say they evolve and they start to regard me and they demonstrate that they are a safe person to be in a relationship with, where we can build trust and mutual regard, then I can bring that boundary a little bit closer. But if that person then violates my boundaries again in a harmful way, what that experience can disrupt my ability to maintain agency over my energy field. So the way that I kind of see boundaries is, at what distance do you need people, things, events, whatever it might be, from your field? From what distance can you be in a relationship that is based on mutual regard and trust and safety? And there are many relationships that you can keep quite close. At least I can, because I've cultivated a lot of really beautiful relationships in my life through this work, that where there's a lot of closeness and it's safe, right? And then there are relationships that we have where we go, you know what, like when I'm around that person, right, I become overwhelmed with this feeling and that feeling, that you've just lost agency over your own energy, right? Now, again, in that example, I'm making it out to seem like the person who I want a boundary from is the perpetrator, right? Like we are also accountable here. So it may also be that person is just being themselves and not intending to cause harm, but I am so brittle and traumatized, perhaps, that I am not, I don't have the agency over my own energy field to begin with. So I'm easily disrupted and easily triggered, right? So that's an example of the other kind of side of that. And so that's when you say, you know what, I need these boundaries, but within those boundaries is where my practice needs to exist, where I'm really working on cultivating that self-love and that self-esteem and that self-regard, where I can not take things so personally and not make things about me and not allow myself to become triggered every time somebody says or does something, right? We have a choice about how we're going to relate to our environment, and not everything needs to create an injury, right? We are resilient. We are capable of resilience.
There's a lot that can be cultivated really intentionally in a therapeutic relationship that then can become more of, the training that is, people can bring to more intimate or more complex relationships in their lives. And I also think there's something to, just referring back to what you were discussing earlier about how you've shifted your kind of practice model in such a way that you're having these immersive experiences with people, but you're not cultivating a sort of dependence on a weekly call or weekly in-person session, that kind of thing. Can you share how you're hoping to serve the people that you work with?
Yeah. I think when there's disagreement or even misunderstandings that arise in the therapeutic relationship, that it's like, I'm always like so thrilled. And when a client and I are presented with the opportunity to navigate through something relationally, right? Like I may have said something that landed for the client in a way, or maybe I said something too harshly that they weren't ready for, or whatever it might be. And, the trust I try to build with my clients is so that they know that I can hang in there through any conversation with, that I'm totally okay with being uncomfortable. And I think I model that in my relationships with my clients. And we create opportunities. I can be very direct, which can be uncomfortable for people sometimes. And there's a method to my madness, right? Like discomfort is helpful in the therapeutic context because life is uncomfortable, right? Relationships out in the world are uncomfortable. So if we can't model that in here, how to navigate those things, then like what expectation should we have about our capacity to do that elsewhere? So first and foremost, there is something incredibly reparative and healing about the relationship with your therapist. With regard to the model that I've evolved into, I loved my private practice. I had my private practice for 10 years. I still have it, but it's just changed. I loved working with people weekly. It was incredible, particularly when you're working with trauma. It is necessary to have those kind of like weekly, sometimes multiple times a week contacts with the therapist or healer person that you're working with, because it takes time to work through some of those really, especially more profound traumatic experiences and to integrate them. So weekly therapy, I actually have had a number of associates. I'm a clinical supervisor. I've had a number of associates come through my private practice, and I often work with, like, I will have a client refer to me and I will send that client to one of them for weekly sessions, and I'll still see them monthly or quarterly, right? So there's a system that I've set up so that I can also ensure that if what's needed is those regular touch points, that's what's provided. I want to really honor that people have different needs depending on where they're at and what they're navigating.
Right.
So it kind of organically emerged that I had more clients than I could handle in a given week. And I was experiencing some burnout around not the work itself, but just the amount of work, right? And so I kind of shifted to this model as a way of saying to the, as a way of creating some spaciousness for me. Now, I still see a lot of clients, but it's also like the clients that I need to see weekly, I see weekly. And the clients that I don't feel that need me weekly, I see monthly or quarterly. And that has just kind of organically, like you said, I felt into it, evolved. And now typically when I take on a client, I only take on clients that I'm going to be seeing monthly or quarterly. And then I help fortify them with the other support that they need. I think it's a great model. I do think that there are clients that need that weekly touch-in. So it's not necessarily dependency, but there are also other clients that do create a dependency, that do kind of come in for a session every week and they don't want to really do any work or cultivate any kind of practice outside of the weekly session. And I can't be the person that's doing the work for your development, right? I want my client to be engaged in the process in a really beautiful way and understand that this work is not about healing trauma so much as it is about evolving into the most expansive version of ourselves and the most creative version of ourselves. And what a beautiful, process and journey that is. And it's never ending. And so since it's never ending, like, we don't have to indulge the trauma story, right? I take a kind of slightly Adlerian approach when it comes to trauma, right? Like I know when I'm dealing with an acute trauma, how to get in there and work with the trauma at a more kind of physical level. But I also know when we're indulging a trauma story and when we've become enslaved to it, it's time to let it go, right? It's time to come into present time. And so the way that I've set up my work really allows for me to kind of go, okay, this person is in this more acute state of trauma that needs a different kind of attention. And this client is indulging a trauma story that is creating victim consciousness that is no longer serving them. And I will not participate, right? And so that's kind of how I operate. And
yeah, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
On one level, it's the distinction between, we know when we're in the presence of trauma vibrationally, and then we know when we're kind of in the presence of a trauma saturated narrative.
Yeah.
Right. And that has a different energetic signature to it. And then also what you were sharing about kind of, as a therapist, having a sense of discernment around when a client is ready and willing to sort of do their own work. Mm-hmm. And that just seems like an example of what you were describing before of modeling boundaries, and that actually is not just for your own edification in the process. It's also because when one of us in any moment of our lives, if we are depending on somebody else for our well-being, we're not self-actionizing. We're not actually participating in our own embodied process of healing.
That's right. And I think we get stuck. We're human. We get stuck sometimes in the vacuum of victim consciousness. It requires a disruption. It requires an intervention. It requires somebody kind of shaking up the system a bit to shake loose some of those, some of that awareness. And I try to do that as respectfully and gently as possible. And sometimes I'm not so gentle in the way that I do that, depending on the client that I'm working with. I always build trust before I before I throw a dagger to try to disrupt the narrative. When your client is ready to let something go. And sometimes that needs to be communicated with a little bit of force in order for them to really also connect with a desire or to awaken in a more kind of like abrupt. It's almost like you wake up from a slumber when that happens,
It's a quality of friendship but I think we sort of, maybe by virtue of sort of losing some of our social intimacy in modern life, have sort of shied away from that, clear, loving, true, direct expression of friendship. Like, I see you,
I see you, I trust that you're capable. And like, the truth can be uncomfortable. And I feel like I try to be a truth teller in my relationships with my clients, even if I feel like the truth might disappoint them or be hard for them to tolerate. And I, try to then help them cultivate the tools for tolerating whatever that is.
Beautiful. It's really, I guess the word that comes to mind is sort of reclamation, like the reclaiming of our own
sovereignty,
so that we can, serve our own well-being and also all of the systems of which we are a part. There's a lot of courage in what you're holding space for.
My clients are the courageous ones showing up to the table. It does take courage to do the work. It does, because it requires holding up a mirror, and we don't always love what we see when we do that. And we have to learn to love all the parts of ourselves and integrate them in order to become who we truly are.
And as you're saying that, I feel that on an individual basis. I also feel it on the collective.
Totally.
How are we integrating all the parts of who we are collectively, splitting away from reality? What we're here with. Kasey, thank you so much. There is so much wisdom and truth and frequency in everything that you've shared. So I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be in conversation with you.
Oh, thank you. Likewise.
Hey friends, thank you so much for listening today. If you find value in these conversations, here's how you can support. Become a subscriber at seanparel.substack.com, and please rate, review, and share your favorite episode with a friend. I leave you with an original song written by Serena Joy Bixby for all of us still learning what it means to be human. Is it love? Is it hate? Grief or heartache, or what does it mean to be human? Is it tears? Is it laughter? Is it not knowing what comes after? What does it mean to be human? Well, I'm sure I don't know. This life, where it goes, the days come, the days go, and I'm still human. One thing I know for sure is I'm looking for more. Gonna go out, learn what it means to be human. I find the joy in the
what it means being